All right, me. So it is uh, the same day that I recorded the football and baseball book, and I ended up also reading Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. This is the second time I read this. I think I read this first when I was probably in middle elementary school, so like third, fourth grade, I think. Maybe it was fifth grade, but around that time. Very, very fun book, right? It is, it's hard to write contemporary science fiction about the science and about science of the time. I think that's probably the hardest piece of science fiction to write. But Jules Verne does it really well here, because Jules Verne is writing at a point in time which is immensely fascinating, in that the world is in fact shrinking in a way that it hadn't really been before, right? Because we take for granted now the existence of immediate communication, right? That communication, even 40 years ago, you could theoretically call anyone around the world. You would have to pay a lot of money to do so, but you theoretically could, right? Or now, travel, you can get around the entire world in a day if you really wanted to, I think. Right? So, this level of science fiction, but science fiction in a contemporary method and not a futuristic ideal or a, Mary Shelley style of adding gothic elements into it. But this is so interesting in that way, right? Especially when I think you consider, off the top of my head, other Jules Verne books, right? Because other Jules Verne books tend to focus a lot more into science fiction rather than this, which is theoretically something that it is realistic science fiction, right? Because the plot itself, right, is that you have this very, very rich Englishman who, reads that someone could theoretically travel the world in 80 days. He then, makes a bet with someone, and they go and do it, right? And what's really shocking is that the character himself, Phileas Fogg, which is a great British name, is someone who's almost always so regular, so is lived down to the second in everything, right? And then seems to very suddenly just go on this trip, right? Which is in of itself a whole other thing, right? But then, so he goes on this trip, goes around the world in 80 days. Really, in reality, goes around it in 79 days. The entire time, though, he's being chased by a detective. And the detective is trying to arrest Phileas because the detective thinks that Phileas committed a robbery and then is now using this Around the World in 80 Days thing as a means of escaping and avoiding the police. So yeah. It's really, at this point, it would just be considered an adventure type book, right? You'd have to have an understanding of the history of transportation to make this into a science fiction book. Really, at this point, it is just an adventure type book, which is fine. That's great. That's fun. It has all those same elements in it, which is great. Looking further into this, right? The way that Phileas, as well as, oh God, I stopped reading his name. Passport, whatever his name is. The way that these two characters think about everyone that they meet is very indicative of the time and the English relationships with the world, right? Because it is, first of all, it's a theory, an idea, and in a story that relies on the fact that much of the world was colonized and owned by Britain, right? And part of that comes down to the fact of the presentation of anyone who is non-British or not directly falling in line with British and European ways as being savages. And so, even we, Phileas Fogg ends up finding his wife and rescuing his wife while on this journey. But what separates, and this is happening in India, and what separates her from the rest of her tribe is that she was someone who was classically trained in English, is much whiter than all the rest of her culture. And that's another name that I started just not reading. Iota, I think is how you would pronounce it. But she's clearly very white, described as being very white compared to the rest of the people that are within our tribe, right? So you're dealing with that. You're dealing with the weirdness of America, right? From a British point of view, the loud, boisterous, always causing a ruckus, no calmness ever. So you're dealing with all of those things, which in a modern, enlightened perspective is not great to deal with, and you don't want to be dealing with it. But yeah. Other than that, it's a fun adventure book. Really, if you want to take away to the very end, you have this issue in which, as gets brought up by Jules Verne, the author, at the very end, Phileas Fogg has traveled around the world in 80 days, has gone to the majority of major cities in the world, and has not stopped in any of them, has won zero money from the bet because he basically spent the amount of money that the bet was for. So even though he won the bet, he didn't make any money off of it. And he ends up arriving there just on time. So it's not like he didn't gain any time. He didn't gain any money. He didn't really gain any experiences or things that we think of when we think of, if we're going to travel, here's what we're going to do. Because he never spent any time there, even on, trains and ships and everything. He's played the same game of whist that he played at home anyway. So he didn't gain any culture in that sense. So, was it really worth it to do this round the world trip in 80 days? And if you're willing to say that, the fact that he did end up having the experience of saving a woman and then that woman becoming his wife, then yeah, how far are you willing to go for love? Right? So yeah, that's all fun. Yeah. I think the only other thing to note with this book is that, if I recall correctly, the way that this book was written, and I don't know if this is the way for all Jules Verne books, but for this one specifically, is that this was released periodically in a newspaper or a magazine. I don't remember which one, but it's released chapter by chapter. So, there's 36 chapters here. That's 3/4 of a year that would have been spent reading this chapter by chapter. Which also then makes sense as to why it is so episodic in the way its chapters are formed, right? Because when you look at, off the top of my head, other things that are written around the same time, what you're looking at is a lot of pieces of things that are where your chapters are just split up differently, versus this book, which is, every single chapter is its own little episode of something that happened on the journey, right? Which is it's fun, it's interesting. It makes sense for what it is. But yeah, overall fun book. If you can get back past some certain issues, it's a fun book. Easy read. If it weren't for the fact that I had an hour and a half phone call with my mom in the middle of this, I would have finished an hour and a half ago before dinner. So that's Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne.